G'day, my name is Lance Witten. I'm sitting with the chairman of the Sekunjalo Group, as well as independent media and the African news agency, Dr. Iqbal Survé. He's also a member of the Belt and Road News Network. Dr. Survé, welcome. We're chatting about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a massive infrastructural project to explain in a very short space of time. But at its core, it is an infrastructural development program that has been started by the Chinese. You've just returned from a forum in Beijing. Give me some of your thoughts about the forum itself and the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you. The Belt and Road Forum is the forum of the Belt and Road Initiative, and the forum was called by the Chinese President Xi Jinping. It was the second Belt and Road Cooperative Forum, and there were 40 heads of state present, 140 countries, and there were about 7 different elements to this, which includes infrastructure. But of course, infrastructure is the main one. It's the key economic driver. There's the Silk Road Economic Belt, which is the land-based infrastructure development of roads and railway lines and power stations, etc. And then there's the maritime Silk Road, if you like, the maritime connection of ports to each other, connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe or Eurasia. So this is a very ambitious project, and it is in parallel with the formation of the United Nations. It's in parallel with the Paris Climate Change Accord. So it's a really global phenomena. And of course, the Chinese are really driving this because firstly, it is the dream of President Xi Jinping. And secondly, they have the capital to be able to do this. And their own view is that by investing in Asia, Europe, and Africa, they're able to promote economic development and in so doing promote peace and cooperation between the various countries.
Now, Dr. Survé, there has been talk, particularly among Western media, about China's investment in these countries other than their own. Words have been thrown around like neocolonialism. Words have been thrown around like death trap diplomacy. What are your views on some of those sentiments?
Well, I think first of all, if you look at the countries that are participating in this, they are very diverse. They are from various different governments, left and right, socialist and capitalist, including G20, G7 countries. I don't think they would allow themselves to be colonized or in any way. China has never colonized any country. To the best of my knowledge, the Chinese have always promoted trade, hence the Silk Road, and hence the Belt and Road, which is really the modern version or the new version of the Silk Road. I think at its very core, countries have to make sure, including South Africa and African countries, have to make sure that you guard your sovereignty. I mean, this is what's important. But one of the critical components of the Belt and Road Forum and initiative is what President Xi Jinping said in his opening speech, is that he wants transparency, he wants openness, he wants clean government, he wants green economy. So in terms of what he has set out as the execution of Belt and Road, it's very different to what is being said. And more importantly, he wants cooperation between the countries and people-to-people cooperation exchange. So it is very different. But it's important for us as South Africans and Africans to embrace this because it's the biggest thing that's happening in the last couple of decades in the world. And if we are silly enough to allow other people to try and suggest things which are not true, but to scaremonger us out of a situation, we are the ones that will face the consequences of that. We have to look after our own interest, and our interest is the people's interest of South Africa and the people of Africa. And Africa needs investment, it needs infrastructure, it needs development, it needs job creation. And this is what we have to do. But we have to do it in a way that we don't get into trouble economically, but the suggestion that the Chinese are going to create a debt trap, well, the Chinese are the biggest investors in Italy. The Chinese are the biggest investors in the US. So if the US and Italy and Spain and the UK are good enough to receive Chinese investment, on what basis should Africans or Asians not receive Chinese investment? It doesn't make sense at all.
If we look at, you've spoken now a lot about Africa needing this kind of development, South Africa in particular, somewhat conspicuously absent in terms of representation at the Belt and Road Forum.
South Africa was not present in any meaningful way at the Belt and Road Forum. The president was not present. The senior ministers were not present. One can only assume that this was because of the current elections in the country. And one hopes that is the case, because there were 5,000 people from 140 countries, and key decisions were made. And South Africa is a part of BRICS, which in a way we are lucky because the Chinese are the ones that have invited us to participate in BRICS, even though our economy isn't anywhere near the size of the other 4 BRICS countries. So I think South Africa needs to wake up. But in fairness, we have to accept there's been an election. And secondly, perhaps there was communication with the Chinese government that South Africa could not attend. But thirdly, I don't think that we realize the scope and breadth of the Belt and Road Forum. I myself was surprised, even though I was invited to serve on the council and I was invited to be part of the think tanks and the forum itself. I was really very shocked at the scale of the Belt and Road Forum. So I don't think my South African colleagues, friends, businesses and politicians and others, other than the academics who were there were quite a few academics from the Confucius Institute, from the various universities. Other than them, I don't think people have realized the scope of all of this. And I think that's what, perhaps what we need to do, and part of this interview is to try and give people indication of the scope of the Belt and Road Forum initiative.
It's quite a massive capital outlay from the side of the Chinese, and that investment into infrastructure, particularly land-based infrastructure, but also, as you mentioned, the maritime Silk Road. But once people are connected via infrastructure, this makes the world a smaller place, which makes skills development and exchange that much easier.
No, totally. Look, the world, humanity is progressing at every point, largely because of globalization. There was a time when there were critiques of globalization, that globalization tended to benefit only a few, and in particular the wealthy. And I think we should look at 3 separate phases of economic growth and the political economy of countries and regions over the last 5 decades. The first phase certainly was one of colonization. Largely the Europeans colonized parts of Africa and Asia and South America. And that happened over the last 100 years or so, and colonization came to an end. But it was really became a new neo-colonized situation where the colonizers still largely controlled the economies of these countries, even though there may have been political changes. So I think that was the first major change in the world from a political economy point of view. The second was that globalization was largely led by the West and multinational corporations in the West, and it was done for the benefit of those corporations. And of course there were lots of criticisms against that, in particular by developing countries, and what is often referred to as the group of 70 countries who didn't see the benefit of globalization, because it was about capital flows into developing countries without there being resultant increase in the prosperity of those countries. And then I think we've come to the third phase now, which is globalization as it was meant to be. And I was always an advocate for globalization, but in the current form. So the current form of globalization is the one that is seeing the Chinese balancing out the power of the US. Now, if we're in a developing country like ourselves, what you want is choice. And you want large states to compete with each other for the right to participate in your economy. So what we're seeing for the first time, and ironically it is President Xi Jinping of China that in Davos 2 years ago was the person in the world asking for globalization, whereas historically it has been the US and ironically Donald Trump, in fact, has retreated from globalization and towards a more protectionist US, as you can see in all of the policies in the US. So we're at the point now where globalization, as defined by the flow of capital, resources, increasingly technology and people between countries, is increasing. Now, globalization can only do one thing. If it is done properly, if it is done with mutual respect, if it is done transparently, openness, if it is done with a clear agenda and without any sort of hidden agendas, then it can only benefit the people of the countries that participate in globalization. But it's got to be real. And I think we will see the benefit of that. So the Belt and Road Initiative or Forum, the initiative certainly is globalization at its best. It's regionalization of globalization between Asia, Africa, and Europe. And it is there to make sure that they are, you know, one of the best examples of globalization is the European Union. Not long ago, you had very many distinct states in Europe. Today, you have one European Union. And so capital flows, people flows, resources, technologies within the European Union has resulted in an increase in European Union trade with each other. Africa has the New Africa Trade Agreements, NAFTA. New Africa Trade, I think it's called NAFTA, or the Free Trade Agreement for Africa, sorry, in Africa. So what we need to do is we need to ensure greater trade. So all that the Belt and Road Initiative is doing, it is increasing trade, contact between countries, cultural, diplomatic contact. It is increasing people-to-people exchanges, academic exchanges. One of the big parts of Belt and Road is scholarships for students to study in the different countries, scientific exchanges. This can only benefit us. As South Africa and Africa, we are way behind the developed countries in the world today. And so the lens that I always look at these things is very simply, does it benefit us or not? And if it does benefit us, what kind of safeguards do we build in place to make sure that we are not in any way exploited, that the benefits really come to the country and its people? And I think that's the way you should look at this.
One final question, Doc. If we look at Africa, which has traditionally, thanks to colonialism, looked to the West for examples of how to do things. If we look now to China and China's investment into Africa, China's investment into the rest of Asia and into Europe as well, you almost see this improvement of living standards that could be a result of this infrastructure development and investment. And who better than China to show that example, having done so themselves, improving the living standards of her own people?
Well, you need look no further than the various reports emanating from the United Nations report on poverty, the World Bank report on poverty, the IMF report on poverty. All of them, without exception, have said that the top country in the world that has reduced poverty in the world, not just in their country, is China. And that's a fact, you know. So the reality is that China took, in 40 years, a very poor country, mass poverty, mass starvation, really backward development in many respects, took all of that in 40 years to become the world's second largest economy, or by purchasing power parity, the world's largest economy. And it has done so by taking 700 to 800 million people out of poverty. So no other Western country has been able to do this in such a short space of time. The West has got lots of good things going for it. The market economy in the West has improved the living standards of people in the West. There's no question about it. In Europe and North America, the advent of the free market economy, the advent of technologies, industrialization, all of that has produced a remarkable improvement in the living standards of people living in the West.
What about the rest?
Exactly. However, the rest of the world has not gotten that benefit by and large. And the Chinese, even though it's a socialist country, they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. The Chinese have been able to do that in China using their own methodology. So what's great about the world that we live in today is that you've got two economies in the world, two different kinds of economies, two different ideologies, if you like, economically speaking. You have the West open free market economy, and where it's a get rich, winner all takes home, the bacon, if you like. And then you've got the Chinese economy, which is driven by the party, driven by the central government, and focused on everybody, so that it's not a winner-take-all economy. But the result of that is that you have 800 million people having come out of poverty. So if you take South Africa, for instance, we have a constitution which is one of the best in the world, strong judiciary, we have a free market, an open economy. Except the problem is that 25 years into our economy, if you look at the JSE, the capital markets, 90% plus of the capital markets are concentrated in the hands of 8% of the population. And so you have a situation where 90% of the population do not have access to the economy, or have not been able to improve. And certainly in absolute numbers, the poverty has increased in the country. So you're having a situation where in South Africa, we have to ask the question, is the economic system beneficial to people? We may argue that, well, democracy means everything. And yes, of course, I'm a Democrat, and I'm the first person that would defend our right to have this kind of open democracy. But the question is, democracy without jobs, democracy without improving the lives of people, isn't a real democracy, because people cannot have freedom if they cannot eat. If a vote doesn't translate into giving you a better standard of living, I mean, what kind of a democracy is that? So the critics of China would argue, well, it is a socialist, closed state. But the truth is that 800 million people are moving not just out of poverty, they're moving from middle income to high income now. So suddenly the Chinese people are beginning to earn the same level as the US. Now that's a frightening thing. So the question is, in South Africa, we can't even build enough houses, which the Chinese build in a month. The number of houses we need to build, in a year. It's crazy. So and so the Belt and Road, by the way, can benefit us, because it's also the exchange of those kind of policies that led to overcoming poverty. You see, what's great about what President Xi Jinping is doing, he is not someone that's come on the political scene recently. He was formerly the vice president of China. He was a senior member of the Communist Party for many years. His father was an advisor to the former vice premier of China. So I think has driven President Xi Jinping, yes, of course, it's Chinese influence, but I don't think that's the main thing. I think he has seen how China has been able to create peace and stability by by actually developing the country. And I think, and in doing so, China has become more wealthier. And is the banker for the world.
It's not about impressing China's own ideologies either.
Not at all.
It's
so
a
this
simple
is
matter
very,
of this is what works.
this is what is shocking and surprising in a very positive way, is that when you speak to the Chinese about the Belt and Road, they tell you, we are not interested in your politics, the internal politics of your country. So we don't care whether your government is conservative or left-wing or whatever. All that we believe is that if you have economic integration and economic growth and development, you improve the lives of all the people, that creates much better economy for the world, and an economy which China itself can benefit from. So they've seen that work, you see, within their own backyard. And I think it's that what they're trying to emulate in certainly in Africa, Asia, and Europe, and I think they're right. And I say it again and again and again. I am a great admirer of President Xi Jinping because I think he's thinking way ahead of any other global leader. He's not going to see the effects of the Belt and Road Initiative in his lifetime. He will see it in the next 50 years, because when you talk about this kind of large-scale, macro, economic, political, people, green economy, digitalization, integration, you are talking about changing the world in a way that the world itself has not known. So the last time the world did something like this was after the Second World War, was after the Marshall Plan, the establishment of the Bretton Woods institutions. Since then, there has never been something as sort of on scale as what President Xi Jinping is doing. And the way he's going about it is an inclusive way, non-ideological way, practical way. I think he's setting the stage for a very different world in the next two to 3 decades.
Fantastic. Dr. Survé, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lance.